Good morning. I'm Captain Butch Rickey, and I run this fine boat here called the Bar Hopper. I'm a professional fishing guide. I live in Sarasota, and I work from Tampa Bay south all the way to Pine Island Sound in Fort Myers area. I spend about 80% of my time down there. We are setting out to produce a redfish video that will hopefully teach you how to catch redfish, not just redfish, but other species as well. If you've come to this video, to this point, to see somebody catch a lot of fish, you've bought the wrong thing. You probably ought to take it back. That's not what we're about. We are actually about trying to teach you how to catch redfish, how to catch all species on light tackle actually, and how to improve your angling skills. Our goal here today is to really have you come away from viewing this tape a better angler than you were when you bought it or when you sat down to look at it. My host today is going to be Captain Mark Best, who's coming down the dock now. A little airish out here this morning. Morning, Mark. How you doing, buddy?
Butch.
Good to see you.
Ready to go catch fish?
Yes, sir. Well, ready to go show them how anyway.
Show me some of these Sarasota Bay redfish?
Yes, sir. We are in Sarasota Bay. Part of this film was shot in Sarasota Bay. Part was shot in Pine Island Sound. Today we're in Sarasota Bay, and we're going to cover some of the techniques of fighting big fish on light tackle. We're going to cover a different live bait technique today, which is using shrimp. We're going to cover artificial lures. We're going to cover stalking redfish on the Clearwater flats up here. We've got a great flat to look at up here. And we might get out of the boat and do some wading. So if you're ready, I'm ready.
Let's go.
All righty. Bait is the whole key to success. What we're going to teach you in this video, hopefully, is how to catch redfish. But we're going to teach you how to catch redfish the way us guides typically do it, which is with live bait. The best live bait out here, and the only bait that you'll find us use, except in the dead of winter when it's not available, is a little bait called a pilchard, which is generically known as a shiner or a white bait. And we go to great trouble to find these baits because they are absolutely magic when it comes to success on the water. Of course, you can catch redfish with lures or with shrimp or with lots of other different kinds of bait, but for your best chance of success, these baits that we're going to teach you how to catch this morning are just the honey. So we're on our way. As I said, bait is probably the most critical element to ensure success out here on the flats. And bait is available almost year-round. It can be real tough in the wintertime, but it can still be gotten. We don't mind, I don't mind anyway, showing customers how to catch bait or where we catch our fish, the hole and stuff, because success out here is a big, long, kind of like an algebraic formula. And if you're missing any part of the formula, you're not going to be successful out here. So, like I say, bait is one of the key issues. And depending on the time of the year, it is what determines where you're going to find the bait. Generally, you're going to find it on the flats in relatively shallow water. And again, depending on the time of year, you may have to use what we call chum, which is a wonderful concoction that we mix up to draw the bait into the boat so that you can cast net it. And then at other times of the year, it's so plentiful you don't have to chum at all. You can catch all the bait you want with 1 or 2 throws of the net. We're kind of in the chumming mode right now. And there's a lot that can be said about chum. Some guides mix up a real exotic secret formula of stuff that includes canned jack mackerel and beach sand and brown, whole wheat bread and anise oil and all this sort of stuff. That's not only expensive, but it's nasty, and it takes a lot of time to do. I use stuff that's commercially available to feed store as a base, which is just regular old egg maker. You can buy 50-pound bags of it for about $8, and then we add a couple of cans of Cozy Kitten cat food and mix it up, and it makes great chum, and it's cheap, real cheap, and it looks like that once you're done, and it's not really that offensive either. You can put your nose to it. Now, what you do once you've got your chum mixed is go to a flat where you have heard or that you know there is bait, and you take little globs like that might be the size of a ping pong ball, and flip it out in the current in the area that you're going to throw your cast net. And what that does, I don't know if the camera can see it, but from just a couple that I threw earlier, you see that there's a slick forming out there, a little slick area on the water. That slick is forming from the chum, from the oils and whatnot that are in the cat food and stuff we add to it. The bait that we're after, the pilchard, is a meat eater, and it will come to chum. A lot of these other baits out here won't come to chum because they are vegetarian type fish, and chum just doesn't affect them. This whole process comes with experience. You're not going to just go out here and do it, but if you take what we teach in this video and apply your determination and skills to it, you'll definitely become a better fisherman with time, especially if you use live bait. So we have shiners that are interested, and it's time to throw the bait. Now Captain Mark's going to make the first hurl. And there's a nice pretty net. Now I carry normally 2 nets on the boat, which are what's in these buckets. I carry 10-foot nets. One's a very fine mesh. It's a 3/8-inch stretch mesh, which is a real fine mesh. It does not gill real small baits. Now look at the camera, turn to the net here. You see the silver flashing in the net? Those are the baits we're after. Those are the pilchards. Now what we do is empty our baits into a tray. Helps keep the mess in the boat down. It also makes it easy to cull out the baits we want and throw the ones that we don't want away. We catch different kinds of baits. We don't always catch just the pilchards that we're after. He's got a pinfish there in the tray. That can also be good bait. Sometimes fish just don't show an interest in the magic bait. They'll hit other baits like pinfish or shrimp or something. Your bait well in your flats boat, if you're going to live bait fish with shiners, needs to be a round or an oval well, because these little guys are not real bright. Once they're put in captivity and put in the well, they will tend to swim into the corners in a square or rectangular well, and they just keep swimming into that corner and butting their noses into the corner, and they'll eventually kill themselves. So if you've not yet bought a boat, one of the criteria you want your boat to meet is bait well, and you want to have a round well. Redfish are they're not real picky. They're not real fussy eaters. They're kind of like me. I'll eat anything that won't eat me first. And a redfish is the same. They prefer crustaceans most of the time, which are little crabs and shrimp. And I've opened up redfish tummies that were full of horseshoe crabs even. And there's no meat on a horseshoe crab. If you get a little bitty horseshoe crab about 2 inches long, it's all membrane. You know, there's nothing in there, but they eat them anyway. They'll fill up with them. And of course, we know they love the shiners. They will also sometimes turn their nose up at shiners and turn their nose up at everything and eat pinfish. This is a pinfish, and he's frisky, and that's one thing that makes any bait a good bait. Come here. I'm trying to hold him without holding him so that you can see him. Now, pinfish is he's easy to spot once you've got him in your hand there. He's got those little subtle stripes down his side. The reason he's called a pinfish is because his dorsals are just like spines, and also his caudal fins. If you just pick him up in the palm of your hand and squeeze, you're going to be in for a big surprise. But the way we would normally fish a pinfish is suspended under a float, because these little guys will do their best to dive and get, there he goes and marks back, will do their best to dive and get down in the grass or the rocks or whatever where fish can't find them. So you got to keep him up out of the grass, and we'll show you how we'd normally hook him. To put him under a float, we'd hook him somewhere in the area of the, just ahead of the dorsal fin. And of course you got to put the hook deep enough to where he'll stay on the hook, but not so deep that you injure his spinal cord or something like that, or punch him in the brain. Then when he's out there, he's free to swim around and look totally natural underneath the bobber. And you can see him struggling to go down right away. Of course, the other bait we're going to fish with today is probably the most commonly used bait out here by most anglers, because it's the most readily available, and that's the shrimp. And we would normally say the hand-picked shrimp. We don't just take any shrimp. If we're forced to fish with shrimp, we want what they call hand-picked or selects that are available from your bait shop. And the way I like to hook them through the tail is just at the knuckle, right in front of the fan of the tail, straight up through, and then bring it out the right up through the top of the shell, right on the ridge there. Now when he's in the water, he's able to look fairly natural in the water. We'll drop him down there for you. Now you can see that when I put this shrimp that's hooked in the water, that he remains sort of neutral, and he doesn't head first or tail first. So if you just keep, in the normal process of keeping the slack out of the line, you'll make him look fairly natural in the water. And again, this is free line normally. We're in shallow water. We don't need any weight. We just let the shrimp go out there and do its thing and just mind the slack in your line. One advantage of hooking the shrimp in the tail is sort of the same advantage of hooking the shiner back through the back, is that he casts head first, which means that if you've got small shrimp, you can cast them further. Because when your bait will go ahead first, you'll always get a little more distance out of him. Now the other way that we hook shrimp is underneath the horn. And again, they're probably even more free, or freer, to act natural in the water when they're hooked in the horn. Now you can see, hopefully, that there are two little dark spots in this shrimp's upper body, the head. And the first one right here is the brain. The second one right under the hook there is the intestines. If you hook him through either one of those spots with your hook, you're going to kill your bait. And then you're catfishing again. Okay? So what you want to do is hook him under the horn without putting that hook through his internals, his vitals. You know, you wouldn't want me to stick you in the wrong spot with a knife, although you might survive it if I stuck you in the arm. Well, it's the same thing with a shrimp. So there's the horn on the shrimp's head, and that happens to be one of the toughest parts of the shrimp. So what we try to do is you lay your hook so that the barb is flat, and then you just slip it right under that horn, which again is the strongest part of him. And I'm in front of his brain. See there, I didn't kill him, he's still frisky. And then you've got a shrimp that can totally act naturally in the water, except now you're pulling him the other way. Now we've hooked him a couple of times and he's not real healthy, but you see how he's staying back up to you? Our favorite bait as fishing guides, and the bait that we're most productive with, of course, is the shiners. The shiners we caught earlier today. Now this morning we don't have real big ones, but believe me, they're big enough to catch anything out here that you want to catch. They're hard to hold on to when you're trying not to squish them. Let's get a good picture of him. That is a pilchard. Depending on what part of the state you're in, you know, different people have different colloquialisms, names for them. They're called generically whitebait, or greenbacks, or shiners. I've heard them called big eyes. I've heard them called all kinds of things, but we call them pilchards. But when you hear a guide say shiner or whitebait, that's what he's talking about, that little guy right there. And he's characterized and differentiated from some of these other baits. If I can find a stray threadfin herring, for example, in here, which probably don't have now. He's got a bigger eye, and he's thicker across the back, and he's darker across the back than threadfin is. Of course, he's a totally different shape than a pinfish, so that's pretty obvious. Here's a threadfin herring. Mark just scooped me one out. Now, I'll let you get a picture of this by himself first. The scales come off these guys real easy. That's a threadfin, and of course the thing that gave him his name is that little thread right there. Can you see? Hope you can see that. Off of his dorsal. Same thread just like a tarpon has. Tarpon's nothing but a big threadfin herring with a hormone problem. Now if I take a shiner, what we call a shiner, and put next to him, I think you'll be able to see the difference pretty easily. If you'll hold still for a minute. You notice the eye is much bigger, like I said. The shiner is more silver on the side, further up the side, and he's darker on the back, or a different color at least. And he's much thicker across the shoulders. And if you actually feel him, this guy is mushy and mealy and not, you know, has a funny feel to him. This guy is solid. You know, he works out. He's a meat eater, and he's pretty hardy. he's most natural in the water if you'll hook him what we call through the nostril. You'll notice that he's got the bridge of his nose between his eye and the top of his lip is cartilage, kind of like the cartilage in my nose. And he's actually got like a little nostril there. And if you put that hook, you see where I'm at there? I'm just barely under the surface of his nose. You lay the hook with the barb flat so it doesn't rip it out. And if you're in the right place, it'll go in hard. You have to actually back it up and push it on in. You see how hard I'm having to push? Now he's hooked. You see the final hookup. It's just underneath the cartilage, right dead center between the nose and the top of the lip. The next thing I suggest you do, once you've got him hooked, is drop him into the water. These guys don't do well out of water at all, and one of the things that makes him attractive to the snooker redfish is the fact that he's so frisky and he's able to swim around naturally. If you look at him down there in the water, if I take the slack off the line, he's free to swim around, and he doesn't necessarily go try to hide in the grass. He will eventually, but you see he's swimming around just happy as a lark, except for the little bit of extra weight he's carrying with that number 1 hook. He's a pretty healthy, happy little guy until a snooker or redfish jumps on him. The second way to hook your shiner, which we use when we have small bait, or if we want the bait to stay up on top of the water, is to hook him back towards the rear of his body. I just call it tail hooking him. It will be helpful. They've got pretty tough little scales for a little guy. Lay your hook kind of down and bring it in about in the middle of his body. Okay, now there's what you've got. And if you do it right, he'll stay on fairly well. If you don't, he's going to sling off easily. Put him in the water. Now if you look down there, you're going to see that he tends to stay up on top. Whereas if you nose hook him, he's going to usually swim down and try to get in the grass. If we're trying to get, if we're fishing a real shallow water with shiners, or we're fishing snook in a hole and and they're striking baits on top, we're going to hook them like that to get them to stay up top. The problem is they draw birds. Birds see them swimming around and say, oh, look, there's easy pickings. So sometimes it's hard to do this. But the real advantage of hooking that minnow like that is when you have small bait, they cast like a bullet because they go head first instead of tail first. And you've cut the wind resistance down, and they really go good. So when you've got little baits, that's the way you want to hook them. And then, of course, everything else is the same. Captain Mark, one of the things we've got to talk about is artificial lures, artificial baits. We, of course, fish live bait most of the time as guides, but your typical sportsman, and I know you and I both are included in that, when we go fishing for fun, we don't usually fish live baits. We like to throw lures. For my own satisfaction, I'd much rather catch 1 snook on a lure than 10 on live bait. It's just a challenge of tricking that fish on a lure. I see you've got a nice display laid out here of all of your favorite toys. How about telling us about each one of those, how you would use it, how you would, if there's any special way it needs to be tied to the line, any particular action you need to give it?
First thing you need to remember is a lot of lures are designed to catch fish, but most of them are designed to catch the fisherman.
Amen to that.
They are a bright spot on the wall, and they catch your eye, and this is guaranteed to catch fish. Well, the thing you need to do is look at what the bait is you're going to be using. This is the pilchard that is the normal forage for the redfish. You want something that's going to imitate as close as you can get to him. If it doesn't look natural, they're going to strike a couple of things. They're going to strike the presentation, they're going to hit the color, and they're going to hit the action. Right. If it acts like a shiner, they're going to eat it. Yeah. That's the bottom line.
Or maybe a shrimp or other natural baits that we have in the water.
Something that imitates what they're normally feeding on.
Yeah.
Some of my favorites are the old Zara Spook. It's a topwater lure. We use this in the walk the dog fashion. Get him out and using rod twitches, you get him to work like this. This is especially deadly on redfish when they're tailing. The problem with them is you got to be patient. You got to resist the urge to set the hook. Redfish have a downturned mouth, so they have a problem coming up, and if the mouth is turned this way and he's hitting it like that, he's going to have a problem picking it up.
Yeah.
when you see him blow it, sit there and wait on it for a minute. If he misses it, he's probably going to come back and eat it again. When you feel the weight of the fish on that lure, you got him hooked.
Takes a lot of composure to keep your adrenaline down, doesn't it?
That's the favorite part. Watch him hit that thing about 6 times and finally gets one set in his mouth.
Yeah.
We got, this is one of my favorites, is the mirror lure. The 7M sinker. And you can see this looks like a shiner, acts like a shiner. They think it's a shiner. I like to use this thing. This particular color is real good this time of year in the clear water because they're hitting the color. It's got a real sharp outline back and silvery sides, so they're gonna see this thing coming and they're gonna think dinner when they see it. And when they hit this thing, there's usually no doubt in your mind that you've got a fish on.
And Mark, that has no action of its own, right?
No.
You have to impart the action to the mirror lure.
If you pull this one, it's just gonna travel straight through the water.
Right.
You can twitch your rod and make it do this. I have taken them on just a straight pull, like a shiner just moving across the grass. This is not a good one to fish in heavy cover or grass. It's real good in the potholes. The oyster bars, keep your rod up high and pull him across the top of the water like imitate a shiner fleeing something.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times that'll aggravate a strike. Anytime you use a sinker, I like to fish them in about 3 feet of water or better.
Right.
Unless I work it real fast and keep it on top. This other mirror lure, this one is a lot of fun to fish.
Yeah, top water.
This one's a topwater floater. It's got propellers front and rear. This gives them a lot to choose from. They get the color, they get the silhouette because it's going to be above them, so they're going to see a silhouette. This one's painted just like a shiner would be. Dark on top, silvery on the sides, and lighter colored on the bottom. That's a preservation colorization for him. He's harder to see when you're looking down on him, and he's harder to see when you're looking up.
Right.
So these propellers create a commotion, and redfish are real sensitive to vibration. They're primarily a bottom feeder. They can pick up a shrimp moving through the grass at great distances. So
And rumor has it they don't have real great eyesight either.
No, they don't see real good. But when he feels the vibration of this thing switch through the water, it kind of rings the dinner bell for him. And they will eat this thing with a passion. We've got some other ones here. I like to use these. This imitates a shiner. This is a DOA, Terrorize. This one just came out. I have caught everything that you can possibly catch on this. We've even took baby tarpon on this thing in the 20-pound range. They will eat these with a passion. This one's worked good as a jig. You can twitch it on the bottom. You can pull it back. It'll create a shiner image when it goes through the water. Redfish especially like these things fished over the top of grass or in the sandy potholes.
Is that fairly weedless? With a hook up like that?
It can be. When I've snagged them in the grass, and they seem to catch a lot of stuff when it's floating. But if you keep an eye on it and you know how to work it and you let it drop and pick it back up, it's not too bad.
Mm-hmm.
Your twitch bait, this one here is made, I don't know what it's supposed to imitate unless it's a worm, but I know the redfish will eat it without hesitation.
Yeah, that's a carryover from the bass world.
Yeah, this is an old bass lure that I guess one day somebody decided, let's see what it'll do, and it worked out good.
Of course, truth be known, many of our saltwater lures that we take for granted, all were developed by the bass guys.
A lot of them. Zara
Yeah.
Spook was one of them. That was an
Yeah.
original bass lure. This one here can be fished a lot of ways. This particular body floats. So you can fish this on top and just make a twitch bait out of it, pull it across the top.
Mm-hmm.
You can rig it Carolina style like they do for bass, or Tennessee rig for bass, pull it across the bottom, or you can pull it fast through mid-depth.
And you can suspend it, yeah.
This one with the soft body, I think the reds like it a little better because they grab it and it gives them a little bit of mush to it, and they go, okay, that's a shiner, I'll keep eating this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, the redfish, his teeth are in his throat. They don't have teeth around their mouth. They got little tentacles, but they got teeth in their throat. And they like to get that bait back in there and chew on it a little bit so they get a good handle on it.
Show us, before you put that away, Mark, how to properly rig that with a hook, with an offset hook.
All right, this is a special hook. This is one that's been designed. It's got a weight in it. Get that thing down a little
Isn't that
bit.
cool?
And what you just shove this into the nose, seat it to the eye, bring your hook back. There's a slot built in this thing to make it a little more weedless.
Kind of like a little pop-open corn purse.
You just put your hook through the center of it, enough to where it's exposed,
Yeah.
and you're ready to fish.
Totally weedless.
It will not snag. You can make it snag, but I've had a lot of success with this particular one. And of course your skirt baits, jig heads work on these.
Isn't that what's called a tube lure?
Well, not really,
I'm not real up on those
this is a
type of
solid
baits.
body.
Oh, is it?
This has got a solid body on it. This
Okay.
holds up a lot better than a skirt does or a tube because it can take a lot of abuse and keep on going.
Yeah.
You can fish one of these for a long time on fish. It's funny, when I fish artificials and I've got another person in the boat, I like to throw two different kinds of artificials. And we'll change colors until we find out what they're eating. And when we find a particular color they like, then everybody goes to that color and that style. And you can wear yourself out with it. The old venerable grub bait. This is a culprit shrimp. This one works good on reds in the bottom, working oyster bars. Snook will eat these things up. Trout eat them up. The nice thing about this is you can fish that all day long and never have to change your lure again. Just keep an eye on your hook. I like to check my hooks after every fish. And if I'm fishing heavy cover like an oyster bar or something, when I pull it through there, I like to check my point. Make sure I'll dress it up, make sure, because if you've got a dull point, you're going to miss that fish.
We're going to talk more about that later.
This is probably the deadliest redfish lure ever devised.
That's my favorite plug right there.
The Gold Spoon. These you can get these in up to 2-ounce offshore lures, all the way down to 1/8-ounce little tiny things. This thing here has probably caught more redfish than any other lure out there.
I would agree with that.
It imitates a shiner going through the water. I've had redfish just absolutely line up to get it. This one's got a little screw on the back. So you can take a grub tail and dress him on that little screw.
A little added attraction there.
You give him a little something else to look at when he's out there swimming around.
My cat would like that.
But there again on this one, on a bare hook or a lure, an artificial, don't trust the hook. Never trust a box hook. I always dress every hook before I put it in the water. I don't want to take a chance on me or one of my clients losing a big fish because we had a dull hook point.
The test for a hook is the old thumbnail test. Just take your lure. Oh, thank you. And lay it with just a little bit of pressure on your thumbnail. And if it doesn't dig into your nail, then it's not sharp enough.
I made a 96-cent investment in this little file.
Yeah.
And a couple of swats through that file. And you're in the fight.
Now, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to bite that nail.
You're ready to fish.
If it won't bite your nail, it's not sharp enough. Redfish, fish like redfish have got they're not only leathery outside, but the inside of their mouth is pretty leathery and thick-skinned. And if you take a bait like these silver minnow spoons that we're talking about right out of the package, I've actually seen them with balls of gold plate on the end of the hook, where it probably wouldn't stick in butter. You've not only got to knock that plating off there, but you've got to get a good point on it. But, you know, if you just take it out of the box like that and go red fishing with it, you're going to miss a lot of fish. You can't hit the fish hard enough with 8 or 10 pound test line sometimes to drive a dull hook in a redfish's mouth.
What you got to remember, Butch, is that redfish are primarily crustacean feeders.
Exactly.
And anything that can eat a crab has got to have a tough mouth.
A tough mouth,
and
that's
if your hook isn't sharp, then it's like trying to drive a noodle into a piece of concrete with a rubber hammer. It ain't going to work.
Well said.
When you get into, I like to fly fish. Reds on a fly rod are just the most awesome thing you can have. There again, you've got a lot of flies that are designed to catch fish and a lot of flies that are designed to catch the fishermen. I like to use the crustacean patterns, the shrimp, the crabs, and We've got a couple of crabs here. That is deadly on redfish, your little crab baits, your clousers, and streamers. We even have flies that imitate the gold spoon.
Yep.
And when you get redfish in a feeding mood, when they're tailing, they're eating. And when they're eating, they'll eat just about anything.
You can get it to them without spooking them.
Get it to them without spooking them. You gotta. The big thing with redfish though is patience. You gotta have patience. It's kind of like turkey hunting. You can slip up on him and about to make the shot of a lifetime, and a bird will fly over and he's gone. So you gotta go back and find you another one. But as far as I'm concerned, that's all part of redfishing. So tell you what, this water looks pretty good. Let's go catch redfish.
One of the most important parts of your fishing day or your fishing adventure has to be tackle and the preparation of your tackle. You can't expect to land big fish on light tackle, for one thing, if you don't have quality rods and reels, particularly the reels. The reels have to have good drags, very smooth drags. You have to make sure that your line is fresh and not old and sun damaged and you know, ready to break at the slightest pull. So we'll talk about rods and reels for a little bit. I use almost exclusively Shimano rods and reels. I use the new Shimano 2000 Stratic FE. That's the latest reel from Shimano. It's 2000 designates a size. I substitute the handle that comes with it for the optional paddle handle because I like that a lot more. We use Berkley Big Game in the green, which is almost the same as the Solar XT color. It's like a solar green, I guess is what Berkley calls it. And this is available. The smallest test I've been able to find it in is 10-pound test. We buy it in bulk spools. But the reason we use this line on the live bait rigs is that it's highly visible. And when we have, you know, customers that are not used to being out here fishing the way we fish, or down from up north, they've never done anything like this. One of the biggest problems they have, and one of the biggest problems you might have for that matter, is seeing the line and being able to detect a bump from a redfish or a trout or a snook or whatever. Although most of the time the hit of a snook is violent enough to let you know that he's there. So the line then is very visible, and it also casts very well. It seems to have good abrasion resistance, all the qualities that you'd want in a line that you're going to use inshore. The next thing we probably ought to talk about is terminating the line, terminal tackle, while we're talking about line. We use, you'll notice here that this rig is very clean. You've got a line-to-line knot from the standing line to the leader, and we normally use about 18 to 24 inches of shock leader, and then you terminate to your hook. The tie fast tool, which is available at most of your better tackle shops, is a little device, has no moving parts, that allows you to tie perfect 100% line test knots. You can tie line-to-line knots, you can tie snells, you can tie nail knots, you can tie your terminal tackle. It's basically a snell, except that you're not snelling the shank of the hook. But the beautiful thing is you can do it without really watching what you're doing. You don't have to see up close. You don't have to put line through little holes. And for somebody that's tied a lot of knots and having to do them fast, this is a great little device. So what we wind up with is a very clean, light terminal rig here, and we usually terminate it with a number 1, or a number 10, usually about as big as we'll go, and that happens to be a Mustad short shank live bait hook. Okay, and a lot of times people say, geez, what are you going to catch on those little bitty hooks? Well, we catch plenty. One of the biggest mistakes we see people make when they come down here from the northern states, move down here and they want to go fishing, you'll see them out here with great big rods and reels, and 20-pound test line, and 2-ounce sinkers, and chain, or not chain, but braided steel leaders, and 3/0 and 4/0 hooks, and and then they'll tell you all they're doing is catching catfish. Well, the reason for that is because they're down on the bottom and they've got all this stuff on the line that you're not, our inshore species, snook and redfish particularly, are pretty smart little critters, and when you present the bait to them, it has to look natural. So the whole goal here in preparing this tackle the way it's prepared is so that when we put our bait, which is our preferred bait, of course, is the shiner, which we illustrated how to catch earlier this morning. He has to be able to swim totally unencumbered in the water. He's got to look really natural, or the fish aren't going to mess with him. If he's laying over half dead and struggling against a hook, or the hook and leader and combination, all that stuff pulls him down to the bottom, well, shiner or not, you're probably going to catch the same thing that the guys that don't know do, catfish. Now, the next thing, while we're talking about tackle and preparing the tackle, if you fish a lot especially, before you leave the house in the morning, you probably ought to check the inside of your guides on your rod, and the best way to do that is with a cotton swab. Just run it around the inside of your guide every once in a while, and if there's any kind of burr or nick in there that's caused from line wear or from accident or whatever, it'll pick that cotton up, and you'll know that you've got a guide with a burr that could cost you the fish of a lifetime, right? Most of your big fish that you hook that get away because something silly happened. Whether you had an adrenaline rush and started jerking on the line, or you had a bad guide, or you didn't check your line, or you had a knot that wasn't tied correctly and it gave because it was only half the line test. But most of the fish that get away that don't just spit the hook, and there's always going to be some that'll do that, no matter how long you fished or how good you are. But most of the fish that do get away, the big ones, get away because of some mistake or lack of preparation that you made earlier or failed to make. So check your tackle often. Make sure that the guides are good. Make sure that your line is good. And you want to really, when you tie knots, you want to really pull test your knots. If they won't pass your pull test, they're not going to pass the pull test out in the field, right? So you got to make sure that you put the same kind of pressure on the knots that a fish would, both at the hook and at the line knot. Another very important part of preparation is setting the drag on your reels, and that's probably one of the most important parts of the preparation as far as making sure that you don't lose fish once you've got them on the end of the line out on the water. We're fishing 8 to 10 pound tests normally, and the rule of thumb that goes with setting a drag is 25% of the line test maximum as a safety valve. Some people will tell you 30. Believe me, you're better off to keep it at 25. So if you're fishing with 8 pound tests, it's easy arithmetic. 25% of 8 is 2 pounds. If you're fishing 10 pound tests, 25% of 10 is 2.5 pounds. And the proper way to set the drag is with a scale, with a good accurate scale. Usually if you've got a good fishing scale, you can use that. Just hook it in the end of your hook. We'll do that for you in a minute. And then pull through the path of the bent rod. In other words, you want to pull and put the pressure on the scale the same way the fish would be on the line, because everything in the line path puts friction on the line, including the water, but we have no way to put that in the formula. And that's one reason it's always better to have a little less drag than the maximum than a little more, because the reel is your rod is probably what you'd say is your first shock absorber, right, between you and the fish. And the reel, the drag on the reel, is the last safety valve. Captain Mark Bess has got the hook hooked on the pull end of the scale, and now I'm going to reel down to him a little bit, and I'm going to pull through the rod just like a fish would until the drag clicks. Okay, you hear the drag clicking, and then he tells me what, 1.5. Okay, I want to set for 2 to 2.5 with 10 pound test, so we'll set it a little higher and try it again.
1 3/4.
All right, a couple more clicks.
2.5.
And you will also notice how smoothly, even at a really slow pull, these reels will feed line from the drag, and that's one of the qualities that you look for in a drag. And Shimano, I believe, happens to have the best drags on the market. So whether you're pulling slow or pulling fast, it'll feed line to the fish and give you that protection on your line that you need. Okay, so we've got that one done, 2.5. Mark, let's talk about redfish resurgence and conservation and a little bit of history, things like that that concern our viewers, where we've been and where we're going.
You know, Butch, 10 years ago when I was just starting out saltwater fishing, redfish were almost like a nuisance. There were so many of them that you couldn't catch snook or anything else because of all the redfish. There was no size limits, there was no bag limits. You could catch as many as you want. My grandfather was guilty of going out in a rowboat in the Caloosahatchee River and catching so many fish that he could barely row the boat back. And we have pictures of that. When the chef in New Orleans developed his blackened redfish recipe and the world suddenly decided they couldn't live without redfish.
Yeah, Paul Prudhomme.
The commercial industry exploded, and as a result, the redfish population collapsed. They just literally blew them out.
Why is that?
When when you catch redfish up in the flats and in the shallows, you're catching a juvenile fish. The 18 to 27 inches is the legal slot limit in Florida, which allows you to keep a redfish. You're allowed to keep one per person. The thing about it is, once a redfish reaches about 27 inches in length, they become sexually mature. At that time, they move offshore in the deep water and they become breeders.
Right.
These are the fish that you got to rely on to build up the next crop for next year.
Right.
If you wipe those out, then naturally you're not going to have a crop next year. The commercial industry was catching them inshore and offshore. 100,000-ton trawlers going out and filling their freezers. Fish was bringing an enormous price at the docks. The export market for it overseas was just awesome, so everybody jumped on the bandwagon, and our redfish suffered because of it. Now, if we can get into a school of reds that number in 100, 200, we think it's a great day. 5 years ago, 1,000 redfish school was an everyday occurrence. We go, oh, look at the redfish over there. Yeah, okay, let's go catch something else. And we just got tired of them because they were so good.
It's essentially the same thing that's happened to our mullet stocks more recently.
Yeah.
Where the fish was harvested for the roe. It's essentially the same thing. You're harvesting redfish before it can reproduce. You collapse the stock, and that's of course what happened with mullet.
Yep. If you kill all the chickens before they lay the eggs, you're not going to have any more chickens.
Yep.
And that's the bottom line. Fortunately, since the net ban went into effect in Florida, redfish are starting to come back. We're not seeing them in the great numbers that we did, but eventually it'll build back up. The one thing I can say for redfish is I think conservation is the key. If you don't have to be greedy, one fish per person per day is plenty of fish.
I agree with that.
Myself,
I don't think they need to change the law.
No, myself, if we catch 20 redfish in a day, and if one goes home, that's fine. I'd rather put 20 fish back in water, come back and catch them tomorrow. They'll be around for my kids to catch. When I was a kid, we'd go out on the flats and we would fish from the bank. And I remember taking garbage cans full of fish home. And then having to call the relatives and the neighbors up and say, come down and get these fish from me because I got too many.
Yeah, well, I grew up, as you know, on Captiva and Sanibel back in the 1940s. This is a true story. In 1960, when Hurricane Donna made pretty much a direct hit on the Fort Myers area, I was a young pup, about 15 years old, and we lived on the bay side of Captiva on the waterfront. And of course, the tide surge brought the water all the way up, right even to the floor of the house, up over the steps. The dock was 5 feet underwater. You know, it was. And you look out, you open your door from the kitchen, and there was the water, and there was palm fronds and all manner of debris and crap floating on water, and bugs clinging on for dear life, and roaches, and anything and everything hanging on to anything dry they could hold on to, trying not to drown. And I said, self, I think I'm gonna see if there's a fish out here. And I went and got my old trusty, back then we used to use Reflecto, number 3 Reflecto spoons, and they weren't wheelies. And I had an old quick reel, and I stood there in my doorstep, cast it, and caught redfish out of my yard. Now that's the way things have changed. And caught a bunch of them. I don't remember how many, but they were up with like a super big high tide, man. They were up in there in that grass getting stuff they never seen before. And when the water finally went back down, they of course went with it. So we actually did that. We caught redfish out of a front yard. When you're in shallow, clear water, if you can't keep the boat far enough away from the hole to where you don't blow the fish out of the hole, it's going to be a long day. So then it's key for you and your buddies, your customers, whatever, to make as long a cast as possible. And pretty much a 100-foot cast out here is a minimum that's required. What you'll typically see guys do, and even, again, veteran anglers, they've never really had to cast for distance, is I'm using a spoon instead of a shiner just for the sake of illustration here. They'll do this. They'll bring the rod behind their back, and then they'll stop. It's like they're picking out a spot, and then they'll cast. Well, that's fine and good, except that using a technique like that, you cannot cast whatever bait you're casting any further than the power of your arm will allow you to throw it. What we didn't do in that case was load the rod. Loading the rod is accomplished simply by making a smooth transition from the back cast to the front cast, okay? And you'll notice that when I bring the rod behind me and change direction, you see the tip of the rod load or bend. What's happening is behind me, when I change direction, the rod is doing this behind me. And that's called loading the rod. Once you load the rod, you store energy in the rod that is released when you make your forward cast, okay? And if you don't think that energy is important to be stored in the rod to the distance of your cast, let me illustrate just how important it is. I'm not going to make an actual cast. I'm just going to store energy in a rod. Okay? That spoon was propelled by nothing but the power of the tip of the rod. So the lesson there is, if you don't load the tip of the rod, you're not going to be able to cast nearly as far as you need to cast to be successful out here. And when you're fishing with spinning tackle and you've got a wind behind you, which we do, it seems, about 95% of the time anymore, it's a good habit to get into to close the bail just as your bait is about to hit the water. Maybe a split second before your bait hits the water, close the bail. What that does is stops the flow of the line off the spool. If you leave the bail open, let the bait hit the water, and you get the wind doing that, blowing the line off the spool. And what happens, once you've got that out there like that, and you close the bail, you tend to pick up loops, what we call wind loops. And I picked up one right there. There's a wind loop. That's a classic wind loop. It's also more pronounced when you get line twist in your line from cranking against the drag or whatever. So the way to avoid that is to simply get yourself in a habit of closing the bail as the bait, just a split second before the bait hits the water, whether it be a lure or whatever. And you'll eliminate most of your line tangle problems on spinning reels. Mark, one of the things I think we ought to show our viewers is the proper way, and this is, I know you experience the same thing on the water, one of the most common mistakes that our customers make, and this includes new anglers, neophytes, and even the guys that say, I've been fishing all my life. They've, in a lot of cases, you know, guys come down here from other parts of the country, they've never fished with light tackle. Or at least they've never caught big fish on light tackle. You know, they say, well, we catch brim or perch or crappie or whatever, but you're talking about a different caliber or type of fight, you know, a different level of fight. When we're catching snook and redfish back here in the backcountry, we're talking about you know, fish that can go typically up to 20 pounds. We don't see them much bigger than that usually, but if you're talking about a 20-pound snook or a 15-pound snook or even a 12-pound snook on 8-pound test line around cover, you got your hands full if you don't know what you're doing. Matter of fact, if you don't know what you're doing, you're not going to land many of them. That's just the reality of it. So when we're guiding, one of the things that we're always trying to do from the time we start our trip in the morning is to give our client a crash course on how to win the battle at the tree line or at the oyster bar or wherever it is we're fishing. So to go on and get into that, one of the most common mistakes we see made is people are trying to fight the fish on the tip of the rod. And Mark's going to help me illustrate what I'm talking about. Mark's going to be a big old snook. All right, now what you typically see is a guy will get a fish on and he'll have the rod held way up here. Can you come up with me a little bit? And he's got the, okay, go ahead and put a bend in the tip. He's got the rod bent like I have there, okay? The problem with that is that if you put a scale down there and let me pull through the rod that way, about all you'll get is 2 pounds of pressure on the fish. And the reason for that is what this guy is doing in this particular case is he's trying to fight the fish on the tip of the rod, and the tip of the rod is designed for what? It's designed for casting, not for fighting the fish. The butt of the rod is the part of the rod that's designed and has the function of fighting the fish, putting pressure on the fish. Well, the tip on most rods would be considered about the last third of the rod. The butt is the part from the handle to the tip, about 2/3 of the rod. So the idea is, and what you ideally want to do is to put maximum pressure on a fish you're trying to turn with light tackle, is to put the bend in the butt as much as possible instead of in the tip. And if you can learn how to put the bend in the butt of the rod, you can increase the pressure that you put on that same fish with the same light line from 2 pounds up to probably 8 pounds. And that can be the difference in making that fish's head turn or not. So what we're talking about then is, instead of this, we're talking about putting an angle on the rod so that you see what's happening here. Essentially, I'm trying to straighten the tip and put the bend in the butt. You see, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit with using the boat, but that's what we're after. So I can put pressure on him with a spool and pull like that. And you notice I'm pulling what? I'm pulling down, not up. And you see where the rod is bent? It's bent almost all the way from the handle. It starts to bend. Of course, there is still some bend in the tip, but now I'm putting a tremendous amount of pressure on Mark's hand as opposed to what I can this way, right? He agrees. Oh yeah, you can feel it, and you can prove it with a scale. If you take the same scale we use to do the drags and have your buddy hold it, try it at home. You know, this is safe to try at home. You'll see that what we're talking about is true. As a matter of fact, if you take a grown man and you go a little bit heavier with a line and do this same test, let's say you do it with 20-pound test, and you've got your drag set at 25%, and now that's 5 pounds, right? And you get your buddy to stand across a room, and you properly bend that rod and pull him, and you have him stand like this, you can pull him off his feet with 5 pounds of pressure. Think about that. That's a lot of pressure when you talk about putting it on the end of a fish. There he is. Now you notice that Mark is missing another one. You notice what Mark just did. One of the things we try to teach our clients. Yeah, there's a redfish hit. Maybe some small reds in here. Synchronized casting, soon to be an Olympic event. What Mark did was put his rod down to the water. You notice he set his hook down, and then he walked down the gunnel of the boat. You can pull big fish out of the trees with light tackle by using your feet rather than trying to use a rod and reel. You can do with your feet what you can't do with a rod and reel. And that can give you the length of the boat, which is critical with a big snook or a big red, especially a snook, to get him away from the trees to where you can handle him.
Tell me why we're fishing here, Butch.
Well, redfish are creatures of habit. Now, you can catch redfish on high tide, you can catch them on low tide, you can catch them out on open flats, you can catch them on the trees, you can catch them in potholes, but that's basically, as you know, depending on the tide stage. On our first shoot, we're faced with a high tide at around noon, which is going to be a couple hours from now. So we're going to have moving water for a couple hours to fish, and what the redfish do is when the tide leaves the flat, the redfish drop off the flat where they've been feeding on the high water. As the next high tide comes in, the redfish will move up on the flat from off in the shelf and off in the channels and cuts and stuff off the flat. They move up on the flat with the tide, and then at the highest part of the tide, they'll get actually up underneath these mangrove root systems, literally way back in underneath. And if you'll notice, you've got a light green area that borders around this whole mangrove key here, which is like a sand trough. It's an area with no grass, and it's a little deeper than the surrounding flat. And the fish, redfish, snook, mullet, as well as the bait fish, use that as an alleyway or a little interstate highway, however you want to look at it. And you have to remember that these islands are the nursery grounds for all of these small fish when they're juvenile, but they're also major feeding grounds for fish once they're bigger. They also provide one other key thing for fish like snook and redfish in the summertime, and that's shade. They can get up under these limbs and get out of the heat. So sometimes the real chore is on a high tide is to get those fish to come out. You might know they're there, but you got to get them to come out and play. And that's one of the reasons you want to have at least 100 baits per fisherman, because we often have to use these shiners as chum to try to lure the fish out of their hidey places up there. Like I said earlier, redfish will move up with the tide and wind up eventually in the trees. And when we're fishing a high tide like this, we're normally looking for a place that has cuts and reliefs in the mangroves that you can throw back into, because the fish will literally lay back underneath the trees. If you don't have any reliefs like that, then you've got to rely solely on getting the fish to come out to the edge of the trees. Whereas if you've got a relief like that, you can put the bait back in there. You understand what I'm saying? And the fish you got a much better chance of getting a fish to come to it. But what we're looking for is a hole like this where you've got a good area of sand and hole out front of the key. It's close to deep water, that sort of thing. One of the big problems you face out here, as you've seen from the ride over, this water is gin clear. This is typical winter type pattern where we're out of our rainy season. The rain and the tannin water stain, runoff from the land, all that sort of stuff is what basically dirties the water up during the rainy months, primarily through the summer. And actually that dirty water is a lot easier to fish, because with water this clear, if we can see that, that flat, that well, that far out, you can sure be sure that the fish can see us long before we can see them. And that creates a real problem trying to fish out here with anything, whether it's live bait or artificials or what, when you're trying to fish out of a boat. Because these fish are basically spooky. They're not going to let you crowd them too much, and they're not going to tolerate a lot of noise. And somebody up on a poling platform or standing on the deck here waving a rod is real easy for that fish to see from a long way off. So in the wintertime, what we typically do whenever we can, we've got customers that'll do it if I'm fishing in this area, is we park the boat and get out and wade. And you say, well, wading in the wintertime isn't that cold? It's really not that bad even without waders, because this water rarely gets down below 60 degrees in the wintertime. It's, it just doesn't get all that cold. I mean, guys come down here from up north, they think it's great. They want to go for a swim, they got to be in 40-degree water or something. But wading is probably the most productive way to fish overall. Because once you get out of this boat and get in that water, as long as you don't make a lot of commotion and fuss, you are absolutely invisible to that fish. Or you may not be invisible, but he doesn't care that you're there. You don't present a threat, I guess. You're a low profile on the water, so you're not easily seen anyway. And I've had, like we were talking earlier, I've had redfish when I'm out on the flats wading. There's nothing more fun for me than to get a bait caster with a spoon on it and get out of this boat and wade this flat. You're out here all by yourself or with a buddy, and just cast down the wind and bring that spoon back to you. You work all these little holes and the grass edges where the color changes, Just keep pulling your spoon across areas like that. A lot of times those redfish will lay in that grass keeping warm, and you can't see him, but he's there. Run across him in a boat or walk up and, you know, almost kick him with your foot, and he bolts out of there and scares you half to death. But I've had them literally swim right up to me and stop and just, it's like they're looking and wondering, what is this? And then turn and swim away. They're not alarmed at all. Whereas if it were a boat, they would have cut a wide swath around it. You know, you're up on the platform, you can see, you might see that fish way out there. He's keeping his distance. You will catch so much more fish if you'll get out of your boat and wade than you will from the boat, especially when the water's clear. You'll be amazed. It would be beyond the scope of this video and probably impractical to try to actually take you on a leg of every kind of red fishing that you can actually do out here, but we do want to talk about it. For instance, tailing redfish. We waited for weather for a long time to try to get you out and actually film some tailing redfish footage, but the weather just hasn't cooperated, because you have to have also the cooperation of the tides. But be that as it may, we can still talk about it and tell you how to do it. If you've got a boat that'll get you to a shallow flat, especially a flat that's covered by 8 to 12, 14 inches of water on a good low tide, you've got a prospect for tailing redfish. If you're not going to use a fly rod or some kind of a twitch bait or a topwater bait to try to catch tailing redfish, if you want to use natural bait, the old shrimp is probably, this is one time when we guides do go to shrimp, because this guy is hard to beat for tailing redfish. But you have to hook him a little bit differently, and they're lively. You have to hook him a little bit differently, and you're also going to use a different hook. What I have here is a #1 bait keeper or bait holder hook. It's characterized by the barbs on the shank as well as the barb on the hook itself. And what those barbs on the shank do, of course, is help to hold the bait on the shank of the hook where you put it. So just imagine this is already tied to the same kind of tackle that we have here. The only difference is going to be the hook. The way you want to rig this shrimp, you're going to remember you're fishing in turtle grass in water that's about this deep. And what redfish do, what we mean by tailing redfish, I probably should even talk about that, because a lot of you guys may not know what we're talking about. Redfish are bottom feeders, not in the sense that a catfish is, that, you know, that eats and cleans up the bottom, eats junk and dead stuff. Redfish eat crustaceans, crabs, stuff that it finds down in the grass, particularly in this turtle grass like we have right here. So when we get the low tide, or even on a high tide, if you've got a flat that's just covered with water, the redfish will get up in that turtle grass and he goes nose down. Of course, his mouth is on the bottom of his face because he is a bottom feeder, and they root in that grass. And when they do that in real shallow water, their tail, and sometimes even part of their body, will stick up out of the water and just be doing this at you. And that fish is so intent on feeding, he's in a feeding mode, that you can, if you're quiet on the flats, you can literally wade and walk right up to within 10, 20 feet of them, and then present a bait at real short distance. Well, of course, the bait of choice is the shrimp, because you can rig it Texas style, what we call Texas style, which is another bass term. That simply means, in our application, what you're going to do is take your live shrimp and bite the fan part of the tail off right at the knuckle, okay? Then take your #1 or a 1, this is a 1-0 or a 2-0. This is the only time we use a hook bigger than a 1-0. If you've got really big shrimp, you'll want to use a 2-0. Your bait keeper hook and put it right up in the tail where the vein is. Run it up in the tail and kind of wrap the shrimp around the hook. Then bring it out about the middle of his legs, like so. Now the next part, you pull the hook on up into his body with the line, turn the hook around, and then impale him back on it, like so. It's kind of like Captain Mark did with that jerkbait earlier. Oops. That wasn't supposed to come back. It came out of there because it doesn't have a line on it. But what you wind up with is a shrimp that's Texas rigged, and all that's exposed is the backside of the hook. Now you can throw that puppy out there in the turtle grass, I don't care how thick it is, and pull him through that turtle grass, and he will not hang up on anything. So once you've got your shrimp rigged the proper way, We like to try to approach the fish again from the, you only want to be, if you've got any wind at all blowing, you're going to have to be on the upwind side of them, because you can't throw these baits with no weight on them back up against the wind. You've got to move yourself quietly around the flat and get on the upwind side, preferably where you can throw straight down the wind so you don't have any corrections for windage, because this is precision casting. When you're fishing for tail and redfish, whether it be with artificials or live baits, if you throw that bait too close to him, you're going to spook him, even though he's really intent on what he's doing, and he's rooting down, and he's like me eating a bag of popcorn, man. I don't know anything else is going on. But if you drop it on top of his head, that's kind of like me sneaking up behind you while you're sitting there watching TV and going, hey, you know, you're startled, and you bolt out of your chair. Well, the red's going to do the same thing. So what you have to do is watch him tail, and you can tell by the way he tails, pretend that's my tail. If you see the tail coming up out of the water like that, and this is his body, you know that his head's pointed this way. If you're standing back here, ready to present the bait, what you want to do is present this shrimp beyond the redfish, a reasonable distance, maybe 8-10 feet, and in front of him, okay, in front of his direction of movement. And he will, as he roots in the water, he will move along real slow, okay? So you present the bait beyond and in front of him, and then after the bait's in the water and it's made its initial splash, the part that's going to spook the fish, then you keep the rod high and reel it slowly back up to within maybe a foot or two of the fish if your cast was that good, and then drop it. Once you drop that shrimp in the grass, the redfish will do the rest. You got to remember, the redfish doesn't know that shrimp is attached to a fishing line, and when he picks up the scent or sees it or whatever it is that actually happens there, he doesn't know that shrimp's not going to run away. So he's going to give you one of the most spectacular strikes you've ever had. He's going to pounce on that shrimp like a cat jumping on a mouse. And it's all happening in water this deep, and you get the explosion of the water. It's all very visual, and it's aesthetically very pleasing. It's probably the most fun way to catch a fish that there is out here, but it's not the easiest. It's difficult because you've got to be familiar with your equipment. You've got to be good with your equipment, good enough to know, to be able to put that bait where it has to be, and perhaps to do that in a wind or whatever. Notice your redfish has a beautiful bronze colored back. Usually it is characterized by at least one spot at the base of his tail. Yeah, one spot on that side. You got a white belly. You notice that his mouth is basically at the bottom of his face, and that's because he's basically a bottom feeder, not in the sense of the catfish is a bottom feeder. This guy eats small crustaceans, crabs, shrimp, live things, not dead things typically. And he comes up in real shallow water to do that. They're also deep water fish. They are channel bass, but we call them, they're known here as redfish. Beautiful fish. They're a lot of fun on light tackle. And after you've had your fish out of the water and you've taken his picture or done whatever you're going to do with him, if you're going to release him, if you've already got your one fish, you've got to put him back. What you want to do is very gently put the fish back in the water, hold him by the base of the tail, and pump him back and forth. If you catch a big redfish on 8-pound test, he's very likely to be worn out and stressed. And it's just kind of like what happens to you after you work out too much with barbells. You get acid in your body, lactic acid, that's right. And he's sort of in shock. And if you put him back without ventilating him and getting him nursed back to health, he's liable to swim off somewhere and die. You can tell when they're ready, when you're holding them by the tail. When they're ready, and they bolt, you can't hold them, they're gone. Until then, you need to work with them. This fish is, let's see how long he is. He's 17 inches long. A redfish will grow to about 13, 14 inches in his first year of life. And he'll weigh about a pound, pound and a half maximum. But if you let that same fish live to be about 2 years old, he will not double in size, but he'll quadruple in mass. In other words, at the end of his second year, he'll probably go 3 to 4 pounds. And That is why the harvest size limits are set the way they are, 18 to 27 inches. If you wait to take a fish once he's 2 years old, you harvest twice the, you harvest 4 times the meat that you do with a yearling like this. This fish is probably a little over a year old. Can you see the blue on his tail before I put him back? See the blue border around the back of his tail? Sometimes it's more pronounced on some fish than it is up there. And when they're in the water, sometimes on the flat, that's the only thing we see when we're stalking them in real shallow water. You can't see the fish because they blend so well, but you can see that blue on his tail against the contrast in the bottom. Well, Mark, here we are at the end of a great day. I want to thank you for being my host and being my assistant.
I want to thank you for being there.
Spreading all that wonderful knowledge you possess. Hopefully we've been successful in doing what we said we wanted to set out to do this morning, and that is not make a video of some guy with a big ego catching fish, but to actually try to teach you how to go about catching fish, how to refine your techniques, and how to be more successful out there on the flats, starting with redfish. Thanks for viewing, thanks for purchasing the tape, and tight lines to you.
Come on, Butch, let's go clean her up.
Captain Butch Rickey is a licensed instructional fishing guide. If you're interested in experiencing an exciting fishing adventure with Captain Butch, he can be reached at the numbers on your screen. Be sure to leave your name, your telephone number, number of people in your party, and dates that you're available. Please allow time for Captain Butch to return your call. He will check the tides to recommend the best days to ensure successful fishing. Captain Mark Best is also available for fishing charters. He is licensed and his business is family-owned and operated. If you're interested in booking with Captain Mark, please see the number on the screen. In addition to light tackle fishing, Mark's family charters provide sightseeing, shelling, night trips, and fly fishing.
It's like trying to drive a noodle into a piece of concrete with a rubber hammer. It ain't gonna work.